The clock had just struck midnight when Ashley Thompson pulled her silver Honda Civic into the quiet streets of Georgetown. The autumn air was crisp and streetlights cast long shadows across the empty road. As a second-year pre-med student, late-night study sessions at the library had become her routine. Her mind was still running through biochemistry formulas when red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. She checked her speedometer, 32 in a 35 zone. Her heart rate picked up slightly, but she wasn't worried. Ashley had done everything by the book. She pulled over carefully, turned on her interior lights, and placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, just like her father had taught her. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Richard Brooks approach. Something about his walk seemed off, aggressive, almost predatory. Her father, a 20-year veteran of the FBI, had always told her that body language speaks volumes. This officer's body language was screaming trouble. License and registration, Brooks barked before he'd even reached her window fully. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. Ashley kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Her voice was steady, polite. The dashcam would later capture every word of this interaction, though neither of them knew how important that footage would become. "You were swerving," Brooks snapped, shining his flashlight directly in her eyes. Ashley blinked against the harsh light but maintained her composure. "I don't believe I was swerving, sir. I've been driving very carefully." She handed over her license and registration, making sure to move slowly and keep her other hand visible on the wheel. The officer's demeanor changed the moment he saw her student ID card fall out with her license. Georgetown University. His expression hardened, and he studied her license with exaggerated scrutiny. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered suddenly. "May I ask why, officer?" "I haven't done anything wrong." Ashley's heart was pounding now, but her voice remained calm. She started recording on her phone, placing it face down on the passenger seat, another lesson from her father. "I said step out of the vehicle." Brooks's voice rose sharply. "I smell marijuana coming from your car." Ashley's confusion turned to disbelief. She didn't smoke, had never smoked, and her car had never contained any drugs. As a pre-med student with dreams of becoming a neurosurgeon, she wouldn't risk her future like that. "Officer, there must be a mistake. I don't smoke anything, and there's definitely no marijuana in my car." "I'm happy to take any test you'd like to prove that." But Brooks wasn't interested in proof. He had already made up his mind about this young woman in her Georgetown sweater, driving through what he considered his streets late at night. His hand moved to his weapon. A clear intimidation tactic. "Last warning. Exit the vehicle now, or I'll have to remove you myself." Ashley's training kicked in, the countless conversations with her father about staying alive during police encounters. Don't argue. Don't resist. Document everything. Live to fight another day. She carefully opened her door, keeping her movements slow, and announced, "I'm complying, officer. I'm stepping out now. But I want to state clearly that I do not consent to any searches of my vehicle." Brooks roughly grabbed her arm the moment she was out of the car. The dashcam captured his unnecessary force as he pushed her against the vehicle to handcuff her. Ashley winced but didn't resist. "I'd like to call my father now," she stated firmly. "It's my right to make a phone call." Brooks laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You'll call whoever you want when I say you can. Right now, you're being detained for suspected drug possession and resisting an officer." As he guided her toward his patrol car, Ashley noticed something that would later become crucial evidence. His body camera was off. But what Officer Brooks didn't realize was that this traffic stop would become the biggest mistake of his career. In his blind prejudice, he had no idea that the quiet, composed young woman he was arresting was the daughter of one of the FBI's top civil rights investigators. The patrol car's back seat was cold and uncomfortable, but Ashley remained calm. She focused on memorizing every detail, every word spoken, every procedural violation. Her father had always taught her that the best weapon against injustice was a clear head and an accurate memory. As Brooks's patrol car pulled away from her vehicle, leaving it vulnerable on the dark street, Ashley silently counted the mounting violations of protocol. Little did Officer Brooks know, but his actions that night would trigger a chain of events that would expose not just his own misconduct, but a pattern of systemic issues within the department. And it all started with picking the wrong student to profile on a quiet Georgetown night. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. Ashley sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists aching from the overly tight handcuffs. Through the partition, she could hear Officer Brooks radioing in, describing her as uncooperative, a complete fabrication that made her blood boil. But she remained silent, remembering her father's words. Sometimes silence is your strongest weapon. The digital clock on the dashboard read 12:47 a.m. when they pulled into the station's parking lot. Ashley noticed at least 3 security cameras tracking their arrival. More evidence, she thought. Her father had taught her to always be aware of cameras. They often became the most reliable witnesses in cases like these. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Brooks roughly guided her through the booking process. The night duty sergeant looked up from his computer, his eyebrows rising slightly at Ashley's Georgetown sweater and clear distress. "What's the charge, Brooks?" the sergeant asked, his tone careful. "Suspected drug possession and resisting arrest," Brooks replied, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "Caught her swerving on Georgetown Road. Strong smell of marijuana from the vehicle." Ashley spoke up, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. "I'd like to formally request a drug test right now, please. I'd also like to call my father. He's a federal agent, and he needs to be notified of this situation." Brooks scoffed. "Yeah, right. Everyone's got some important relative when they're in cuffs." He turned to the sergeant. "She's been trying this federal agent story since I pulled her over." The sergeant studied Ashley more carefully now. Something about her composure didn't match Brooks's description of an unruly drug suspect. "Brooks, did you read her rights?" "Course I did," Brooks snapped, though Ashley knew he hadn't. Another violation for the growing list. The booking process continued, each moment adding to the humiliation. Ashley's fingerprints were taken, her belongings catalogued. Her phone was confiscated before she could make any calls. She noticed the intake officer's slight hesitation when logging her occupation, second-year medical student, Georgetown University. In the holding cell, Ashley sat on the cold metal bench, her mind racing but focused. She began mentally documenting everything: the time of the stop, Brooks's exact words, the missing body camera, the denied phone call. The cell's other occupant, a middle-aged woman who'd been brought in for public intoxication, watched her with sympathy. "You don't look like you belong here, honey," the woman said softly. Ashley managed a small smile. "I don't, and I won't be here long." Hours passed. Ashley watched officers walk by, some giving her curious glances. She'd requested a drug test 3 more times, each request documented by the duty officer but ignored by Brooks. She'd also repeated her request to call her father 6 times, each denial another violation of her rights. Around 3 a.m., a young officer Ashley hadn't seen before approached her cell. She'd been watching him for the past hour, noticing how he kept glancing at her paperwork with growing concern. "Miss," he said quietly, "I'm Officer Chen. I couldn't help but notice your father's name on your emergency contact form. Is he really?" Ashley met his eyes steadily. "Yes, he is, and he still hasn't been notified." Officer Chen's face paled slightly. He quickly walked away, but Ashley could see him in heated discussion with the duty sergeant moments later. The sergeant's expression changed as he looked over at her cell, then back at her paperwork. Suddenly, there was a flurry of activity in the station. The sergeant was on the phone, his voice low but urgent. Officer Brooks, who'd been lounging at his desk filling out paperwork, was called into the captain's office. Through the office's windows, Ashley could see Brooks's posture change from cocky to concerned. What Officer Brooks was learning, far too late, was that Ashley's father wasn't just any federal agent. He was Deputy Director Thompson, head of the FBI's Civil Rights Division for the entire Eastern Seaboard. And he was about to get a phone call about his daughter being held without charges, denied her rights, and racially profiled by a cop with a history of similar complaints. In the holding cell, Ashley finally allowed herself a small smile. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, and Officer Brooks was about to learn a very important lesson about making assumptions. She thought about all the other people who'd faced similar treatment but didn't have a father in the FBI. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about them too. The station's atmosphere had shifted completely. Officers who'd ignored her earlier were now casting worried glances her way. The sergeant was making more phone calls, his face growing increasingly concerned. And somewhere in the city, her father was about to receive a call that would set in motion an investigation that would change the department forever. Dawn was breaking outside the small window of her cell when Ashley heard the station doors burst open. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed through the corridor. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The time for justice had arrived, and Officer Brooks was about to learn that some mistakes come with consequences that no badge can shield you from. Deputy Director Thompson was reviewing case files in his FBI office when his phone buzzed at 3:47 a.m. The late hour immediately set off alarm bells. Midnight calls rarely brought good news in his line of work. When he saw the precinct's number, his heart skipped a beat. His daughter hadn't answered his routine home safe text after her study session. Deputy Director Thompson speaking, he answered, his voice carrying the authority of his 20 years of service. The nervous shuffle on the other end of the line told him everything he needed to know before the sergeant even spoke. "Sir, this is Sergeant Wilson from the Georgetown precinct. We have a situation involving your daughter." Thompson's hand tightened on his pen, but his voice remained steady. "Explain." As the sergeant detailed the events, the traffic stop, the alleged marijuana smell, the denied phone call, Thompson's jaw clenched. He recognized the officer's name immediately. Brooks. 3 civilian complaints of racial profiling had crossed his desk in the past month alone. "Sir, we just confirmed her identity and," the sergeant stammered. "And you're calling me 4 hours after her arrest?" Thompson's voice was quiet, but the sergeant flinched as if he'd shouted. "Tell me, Sergeant Wilson, is it standard procedure to deny a detained suspect their phone call?" "No, sir." Officer Brooks said. "I'm not interested in what Officer Brooks said." Thompson was already pulling up Brooks's service record on his computer. "I'm interested in why my daughter's constitutional rights were violated. I'm interested in why an officer with multiple profiling complaints is still conducting solo traffic stops, and I'm very interested in why his body camera was conveniently turned off during this encounter." The silence on the other end was deafening. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Thompson continued. "I expect every piece of documentation from tonight's incident on the captain's desk when I arrive, including the dashcam footage, and Sergeant, make sure Officer Brooks doesn't leave the building." Thompson ended the call and sat back in his chair, taking 3 deep breaths. The father in him wanted to storm the precinct with sirens blazing, but the FBI agent in him knew better. This wasn't just about Ashley anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been profiled by Brooks, every complaint that had been swept under the rug. He opened his laptop and began typing. Within minutes, he had accessed Brooks's complete service record. 15 complaints of excessive force, 23 allegations of racial profiling, all dismissed or marked inconclusive. Thompson's trained eye spotted the pattern immediately: late-night stops, alleged drug smells, predominantly minority suspects. His phone buzzed again. A text from his old partner in the Civil Rights Division. "Heard about Ashley. Green light for the investigation you've been pushing for. Full resources at your disposal." Thompson allowed himself a grim smile. For months, he'd been building a case about systemic profiling in certain precincts. But he'd lacked the political will to launch a full investigation. Brooks had just handed him the key to blow the whole thing wide open. He gathered his files and jacket, his mind already mapping out the investigation. As he walked to his car, he made 3 calls, one to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, one to Internal Affairs, and one to a federal judge who owed him a favor. The night air was cool as he drove toward the precinct. His daughter was strong. He'd made sure of that. She knew her rights, knew how to handle herself. But his heart ached thinking of her sitting in a cell, experiencing the very injustice he'd spent his career fighting against. At a red light, Thompson glanced at the photo on his dashboard. Ashley at her high school graduation, beaming in her valedictorian robes. She'd given a speech that day about justice and equality. "Change doesn't just happen," she'd said. "Someone has to stand up and demand it." The light turned green, and Thompson pressed the accelerator. Officer Brooks had picked the wrong student to profile tonight. But more importantly, he'd given Thompson the ammunition needed to create real change. This wouldn't be a story of revenge, it would be a story of reform. As the precinct came into view, Thompson straightened his tie and badge. In his briefcase were 20 years of civil rights expertise, a father's determination, and the full weight of federal law enforcement. The game was about to change, and Officer Brooks had no idea he'd just become the catalyst for his own department's complete overhaul. Walking up the precinct steps, Thompson's phone buzzed one final time. A message from his supervisor: do what needs to be done. Full backing from the director. He tucked his phone away, squared his shoulders, and opened the door. The night shift officers looked up, recognition dawning on their faces. Deputy Director Thompson had arrived, and with him, the long arm of justice was about to reach into the darkest corners of a system that desperately needed cleaning. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest anymore. It was about changing the system itself, one corrupt officer at a time. The precinct's conference room had been transformed into a command center by sunrise. Deputy Director Thompson sat at the head of the table, surrounded by stacks of files, his laptop open to Brooks's service record. The room buzzed with activity as his hand-picked team of investigators worked through years of traffic stop data. "Take a look at this pattern," Agent Rivera said, pointing to a spreadsheet. Brooks conducted 127 late-night stops in the past 6 months. 85% of them involved minority drivers. That's way above the district average. Thompson nodded, making notes. On the wall-mounted screens, dashcam footage from dozens of Brooks's stops played silently. The similarities were striking: the same aggressive approach, the same smell of marijuana excuse, the same pattern of escalation. "Sir, you need to see this," called out Agent Chen, waving a file. 3 months ago, a pre-law student filed a complaint almost identical to Ashley's case. Same location, same alleged violation, same denied phone call. The complaint was dismissed due to lack of evidence, even though dashcam footage existed. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Where's that footage now?" "Conveniently corrupted," Chen replied, his disgust evident. "But here's the interesting part. The student's father works in IT. He made a backup before it disappeared." A small smile crossed Thompson's face. "Get that father on the phone. Now." The investigation was expanding beyond Brooks. Each thread they pulled revealed new connections, new patterns of misconduct. Thompson had seen corruption before, but this was different. This was systematic, organized, protected. His phone buzzed, a text from Ashley. "Dad, there are others here who've had similar experiences. They're willing to talk." He showed the message to Rivera. "Get a team to the holding cells. I want statements from everyone Brooks has brought in over the last 24 hours. By noon, the evidence wall was covered in photos, documents, and timelines. Brooks's misconduct wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger problem within certain units of the department. Officers who covered for each other, evidence that conveniently disappeared, complaints that were systematically dismissed. "Director," Agent Park called out, her voice tight with concern. "I've been going through Brooks's personal files. You need to see these text messages." The messages revealed a group of officers who called themselves the Night Shift Squad. They shared tips on how to justify stops, how to avoid body camera rules, which judges would sign off on flimsy warrants. Brooks wasn't just a bad apple, he was part of a corrupt network. Thompson was reviewing the messages when Captain Reynolds from Internal Affairs walked in. The captain's face was grim. "It's worse than we thought," Reynolds said, dropping a thick folder on the table. "We've identified at least 12 officers involved in this scheme. They've been targeting university students, especially minorities, hoping their complaints wouldn't be taken seriously." Thompson leaned back, his mind racing. This was no longer just about Ashley's arrest, it was about exposing a deep-rooted culture of corruption. "Sir," Rivera interrupted, "Brooks is in interrogation room 3. He's asking for his union rep." "Let him wait," Thompson replied, studying the evidence wall. "I want him to see exactly what we're building here." The afternoon brought more revelations. Former victims started coming forward, encouraged by news of the FBI investigation. Their stories were remarkably similar: late-night stops, false accusations, rights violations, dismissed complaints. Agent Chen returned from the IT department with more recovered dashcam footage. They tried to delete these, but we managed to recover most of them. Sir, some of these stops, they're textbook civil rights violations. Thompson watched the footage, his jaw set. On screen after screen, he saw the same abuse of power playing out. Young people, mostly minorities, being harassed, intimidated, and arrested on false pretenses. Update from the DA's office, Park announced, hanging up her phone. They're reviewing every case Brooks has been involved in for the past 5 years. Early estimates suggest at least 50 convictions might need to be overturned. The implications were staggering. Lives had been derailed, careers ruined, futures altered, all because of a corrupt group of officers who thought they were untouchable. As evening approached, Thompson stood before the evidence wall, taking it all in. What had started as one wrongful arrest had exposed a cancer within the department. Brooks and his night shift squad had created a system of organized harassment and discrimination, thinking their badges would protect them forever. Director Rivera said softly, "Brooks's union rep is here. They're ready to talk." Thompson straightened his tie, gathering the key files. This wasn't just about getting justice for Ashley anymore. This was about changing a broken system, about giving voice to every person who'd ever been silenced by abuse of power. "Let's go," he said, heading toward the interrogation room. It's time Officer Brooks learned that no badge is big enough to hide from justice. Behind him, the evidence wall told a story of systematic abuse. But more importantly, it told a story of change. How one incident, one brave stand, could spark a revolution in accountability. The night shift would never be the same again. The interrogation room felt smaller than usual as Deputy Director Thompson sat across from Officer Brooks and his union representative. The table between them was covered with carefully selected evidence, photos, transcripts, and recovered text messages that told a damning story. "Let's start with last night," Thompson began, his voice calm but firm. "Walk me through why you stopped my daughter." Brooks shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his union rep. Gone was the arrogant officer from the traffic stop. In his place sat a man who was beginning to realize just how deep a hole he'd dug for himself. "I observed the vehicle swerving," Brooks began, but Thompson cut him off by playing the dashcam footage. The video clearly showed Ashley's car driving perfectly straight, well under the speed limit. "Try again," Thompson said quietly, "and this time, remember that lying to a federal officer carries its own charges." What followed was a 3-hour interview that revealed more than just one bad officer's misconduct. Brooks, facing the weight of evidence against him, began to crack. He spoke about the night shift squad, about unofficial quotas, about supervisors who looked the other way as long as arrest numbers stayed high. Outside the interrogation room, Agent Rivera was coordinating with the Department of Justice. "We've got 15 more victims coming in to give statements," she reported to her team. "And the DA's office just called. They're forming a special task force to review every arrest made by Brooks and his associates." The investigation had taken over an entire floor of the FBI building. Evidence boards lined the walls, each telling a story of systematic abuse of power. But among the legal documents and police reports were photos, faces of the people whose lives had been impacted by these corrupt officers. There was the college athlete who lost his scholarship after a false arrest. The young teacher whose career nearly ended because of planted evidence. The medical student who missed her board exams while sitting in a cell on bogus charges. Each story added another brick to the wall of evidence they were building. "Director," Agent Chen called out, waving a stack of papers, "we just got access to Brooks's personal emails. You need to see these conversations with other officers about targeting specific neighborhoods and profiles." Thompson took the emails, his expression hardening as he read. The messages revealed a calculated system of discrimination hidden behind a thin veneer of law enforcement. But what struck him most were the casual jokes, the easy way these officers dismissed the rights of the people they were sworn to protect. In another room, Internal Affairs Captain Reynolds was interviewing Officer Wilson, one of Brooks's closest associates. The young officer had cracked under pressure, offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. "They had a whole system," Wilson explained, his voice shaking. "Brooks would make the stops, I'd handle the paperwork, and Sergeant Miller would make sure the complaints disappeared. We thought we were untouchable." The evidence was mounting hour by hour. Financial records showed unexplained deposits in several officers' accounts. Text messages revealed coordination of false arrests. Body camera footage that had supposedly been lost was recovered, showing clear violations of department policy and constitutional rights. Thompson stood in the command center, surveying the growing case. On one screen, statistics showed the stark pattern of discrimination. 80% of the night shift squad's arrests involved minority students and young professionals. Another screen displayed a map of their traffic stops, clustering around college campuses and diverse neighborhoods. "Sir," Rivera interrupted his thoughts, "the police commissioner is here. He's requesting a briefing." The commissioner's face grew increasingly pale as Thompson presented the evidence. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents, it was a systematic failure of oversight and accountability. "How did we miss this?" the commissioner asked, more to himself than anyone else. "You missed it because you weren't looking," Thompson replied. "But now you have a chance to help us fix it." As evening approached, the team gathered for a case review. The evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of wrongful arrests, dozens of civil rights violations, a network of corrupt officers working together to abuse their power. "Tomorrow, we move to the next phase," Thompson announced to his team. "We've built the case. Now it's time to ensure this never happens again." Agent Park was updating the case timeline when a young officer rushed in. "Director, you need to see this. We just found a hidden folder on Brooks's work computer. There are recordings, conversations between him and other officers planning these stops. They're bragging about it." Thompson listened to the recordings, each word cementing his resolve. This case had started with his daughter's wrongful arrest, but it had become something much bigger. It was about every person who'd ever been profiled, every life that had been disrupted by abuse of power, every citizen who'd lost faith in the system meant to protect them. As night fell over the city, Thompson looked out his office window at the lights below. Tomorrow, they would begin dismantling a corrupt system that had operated in shadows for too long. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment to remember why this fight mattered, not just for Ashley, but for every person who deserved equal justice under the law. The case they'd built was more than just evidence and testimonies. It was a promise to every citizen that wearing a badge didn't put you above the law. And in the morning, that promise would begin to be fulfilled. The morning sun was just breaking over the city skyline when the operation began. FBI agents and internal affairs officers moved simultaneously across different precincts. The night shift squad had no warning when the arrests started. Officer Brooks was first, taken into custody as he left his morning shift. The same handcuffs he used to detain countless innocent people now circled his own wrists. His face showed pure shock as Agent Rivera read him his rights, not as a courtesy, but as the constitutional requirement he ignored so many times before. At the FBI headquarters, Deputy Director Thompson watched the arrests unfold on multiple screens. Each officer's face told a story of arrogance broken by accountability. Sergeant Miller, who'd buried so many complaints, was led out of his house still in his pajamas. Officer Wilson, despite his cooperation, faced his own moment of justice. "All primary targets are in custody," Agent Chen reported, updating the status board. "No incidents, no resistance. They never expected to be held accountable." The press conference that followed was one for the history books. The police commissioner stood beside Thompson, both men grave-faced as they addressed a room packed with reporters. "Today marks a turning point," Thompson began, his voice carrying the weight of both professional duty and personal victory. "What started as a single wrongful arrest has exposed a pattern of systematic civil rights violations within our police department." The numbers were staggering. 12 officers arrested, over 300 cases flagged for review, millions in potential civil settlements. But the real story was in the human impact. In the audience, faces told stories of vindication. A young woman who'd lost her teaching job due to a false arrest wiped away tears. A college student whose medical school dreams had been derailed by Brooks's false charges sat straighter, knowing his record would finally be cleared. Ashley sat in the front row, her presence a silent testimony to every person who'd ever faced injustice but lacked the resources to fight back. Her eyes met her father's as he detailed the investigation's findings, both knowing that this was bigger than their family now. The investigation revealed a coordinated effort to target specific demographics, Thompson continued. Officers shared techniques for fabricating probable cause, manipulated evidence, and systematically violated constitutional rights. This ends today. The reforms announced were sweeping. Every officer would now wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off during stops. An independent civilian review board would oversee all complaints. Mandatory bias training would be implemented, with real consequences for violations. But the biggest change was in accountability. No more buried complaints, no more looking the other way. A new digital system would track every stop, every arrest, every use of force, accessible to both internal affairs and civilian oversight committees. In the weeks that followed, the impact rippled through the justice system. The district attorney's office began reviewing cases, starting with the most recent and working backward. Convictions were overturned, records expunged, lives restored. Brooks and his core group faced federal charges. Civil rights violations carried heavy sentences. The blue wall of silence crumbled as more officers came forward, choosing truth over toxic loyalty. 3 months later, Ashley stood at a podium in the law school auditorium. The audience was filled with future lawyers, judges, and law enforcement officers. Her story had become a case study in justice reform. "Change doesn't come from staying silent," she told them, her voice strong. "It comes from standing up, speaking out, and demanding better." One person's story can spark a movement, but it takes all of us to create lasting change. In the back of the room, Thompson watched his daughter with pride. The case had transformed from a father's quest for justice into a catalyst for systemic reform. Other departments across the country were now adopting their new accountability measures. The old guard of the night shift squad faced their sentences. Brooks, defiant to the end, received 15 years for civil rights violations and evidence tampering. Others made deals, trading information for leniency, but none would wear a badge again. 1 year later, Thompson stood in the new Police Academy Training Center. On the wall, a plaque listed the reforms born from the investigation, a constant reminder to every new officer that power comes with responsibility. "Your badge is not a shield from accountability," he told the fresh-faced recruits. "It's a symbol of public trust, and that trust must be earned every day, with every interaction, with every citizen you serve." The changes weren't perfect, reform never is, but in precincts across the city, a new culture was taking root. Young officers learned from the mistakes of the past, committed to doing better, to being better. And somewhere in the city night, a car was being pulled over. The officer approached with respect, body camera recording, procedures followed to the letter. The driver, nervous at first, relaxed as their rights were properly explained. This was the real victory, not just justice served, but justice transformed. One traffic stop had exposed corruption, but more importantly, it had shown that change was possible. That in the end, the law could work the way it was meant to, protecting all citizens equally, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The story of Ashley's arrest would be told for years in police academies and law schools, not just as a cautionary tale, but as proof that justice, though sometimes delayed, could not be denied when good people stood firm against corruption.